The Galactic Empire spanned thousands of star systems, ruling with an iron fist. To its citizens, it was an unshakable force, unyielding, invincible, eternal. It had crushed rebellions, assimilated civilizations, and rewritten history in its favor. Its military strength dwarfed that of any single species, its bureaucracy ensured total control, and its propaganda machine ensured that its conquests were seen as inevitable progress. Humanity, a relatively new entrant into the galactic stage, was seen as insignificant. A minor species with fragile bodies and primitive warships. The Empire tolerated them, allowed them trade, and even entertained diplomatic exchanges. But to the ruling elite, humans were just another race to be manipulated or conquered when the time was right. They had seen countless others before, and none had ever truly resisted imperial dominance for long. Skirmishes had happened, of course. Small border conflicts, misunderstandings, and the occasional aggressive imperial patrol testing human defenses. But they were minor. The Empire barely considered them wars, more like inconveniences. And every time, humanity had sued for peace, negotiated settlements, and proven itself to be a diplomatic species, always seeking solutions over conflict. It was a weakness in the Empire's eyes. When war finally broke out, it wasn't even considered a war at first. The Empire attacked a human colony, citing fabricated reasons, claims of espionage, violation of imperial law, a security risk. The truth was irrelevant. The Empire wanted to test humanity's response. And, as expected, humans protested, sent envoys, and demanded diplomatic talks. The Empire allowed it, knowing it would stall real action. In the meantime, it pressed further, escalating, waiting to see when humanity would fold. A battle occurred. A fleet of human ships, outmatched and outgunned, stood their ground against the imperial war machine. It was a massacre, but not without cost to the Empire. Human ships fought in unexpected ways, using tactics that disregarded the rigid military doctrines the Empire had perfected over centuries. For the first time in decades, an imperial admiral reported casualties that weren't trivial. The battle ended with survivors. A group of human soldiers, captured, bound, and transported deep into imperial space. They were no threat, and by galactic convention, prisoners of war were to be exchanged, held for negotiations, or used as bargaining tools. But to the Empire, humans were not equals. They were not a race to be respected. And so, the decision was made, without hesitation or consideration for consequence. The prisoners would not be ransomed. They would not be returned. They would be executed. When news of the capture reached Earth, humanity followed protocol. A diplomat was sent. A veteran of many negotiations, a man who had navigated interstellar politics for years. He had seen war before, seen conflicts that could have been avoided if only the right words had been spoken. He believed in diplomacy not as a tool, but as a necessity. War, to him, was the failure of civilization. He met with imperial officials. He laid out humanity's terms. Peace, an exchange of prisoners, reparations for the colony attack. A fair deal, a rational solution. The Empire listened, entertained the conversation, and assured him that the prisoners were being treated according to galactic law. It was a lie. The decision had already been made. The Empire had no intention of negotiating. The prisoners were paraded before cameras, bound and beaten, then executed on a live broadcast, streamed across the known galaxy. It was not just a display of power. It was a message. To the Empire, it was nothing new. They had done this before, countless times. It had worked before. It would work again. To humanity, it was something else entirely. It was a line crossed. An act that could not be forgiven. The diplomat, who had spent his life avoiding war, stood frozen as the footage played before him. He watched as the prisoners, his people, were slaughtered without hesitation, without mercy. He watched as imperial leaders smirked, as alien spectators dismissed it as just another example of the Empire asserting its will. The room was silent. He said nothing. Then, he left. He did not return to negotiate. He did not stay to argue, to plead, to find another peaceful resolution. That possibility had died alongside those men and women. By the time he reached Earth, humanity had already seen the broadcast. Protests had erupted. Calls for retaliation echoed across the planet and its colonies. The outrage was not political. It was not strategic. It was primal. And so, for the first time in its history, humanity declared total war. The galaxy had seen wars before. Rebellions, skirmishes, conflicts that flared up and burned out, always ending with the Empire standing victorious. This was different. The footage of the massacre spread across human-controlled space, and with it, the last remnants of diplomacy crumbled. Leaders of Earth and its colonies convened in an emergency session. There were no debates, no lengthy discussions. The choice had already been made. The declaration of war was a formality. Humanity had been attacked before, but this was different. This was personal. The diplomat who had once spoken for peace now stood at the center of the room. His voice was calm, controlled, but beneath it was something sharp, something unyielding. He recounted what had happened, not as a plea for reason, but as a final verdict. The Empire had declared humanity an enemy. Now, humanity would return the favor. A message was sent, not just to the Empire, but to the entire galaxy. It was simple. The Empire had crossed a line that could not be undone. The response would be absolute. There would be no negotiations, no peace talks, no surrender. Humanity was not here to beg for justice. It was here to deliver it. The reaction from the galaxy was mixed. Some species watched with curiosity, others with indifference. War with the Empire was suicide. No civilization had ever won. The galaxy had seen this before, a species lashing out in rage, thinking it could fight, only to be crushed and forgotten. But something was different this time. The mobilization began immediately. Every industrial world switched to wartime production. Factories that had once built ships for exploration and trade now churned out war machines. Scientists who had once worked on peaceful innovations turned their knowledge toward weapons. Military officers drafted strategies not for defense, but for total destruction. The war was not coming. It had already begun. Human fleets moved with precision. They didn't strike where the Empire expected. They didn't challenge the Empire's massive fleets in open battle. Instead, they targeted weak points, supply lines, communication hubs, logistical centers. Every Imperial victory was hollow, as their fleets found themselves stranded, cut off, unable to reinforce their positions. The Empire had the numbers, but numbers meant nothing if they couldn't move. The first true battle came swiftly. The Empire, still confident in its superiority, sent a fleet to crush what it assumed was a desperate human attack. What it found instead was something the Empire had never encountered before, an enemy that refused to fight on the Empire's terms. The battle was not a grand clash of armadas, not a glorious engagement where the Empire could showcase its strength. It was chaos. Human ships moved unpredictably, striking and vanishing before counterattacks could land. They disabled Imperial capital ships instead of destroying them, leaving massive vessels drifting and vulnerable. They targeted commanders, disrupting chain of command. They turned the Empire's own tactics against it, exploiting its rigid structure. By the time the battle ended, the Imperial fleet was in ruins. Survivors fled, not in a coordinated retreat, but in panic. It was the first real defeat the Empire had suffered in centuries. The news spread quickly. The Empire downplayed it, dismissing the loss as insignificant. But in the halls of power, there was unease. Humanity was not fighting like the others. It wasn't seeking survival. It wasn't fighting for a peace treaty. It was fighting to win. The diplomat, once a man of words, now became something else. He wasn't a military strategist, but he didn't need to be. His role had changed. He wasn't negotiating for peace. He was delivering a message with every strike, every battle, every imperial world that fell. The Empire attempted to respond, sending larger fleets, deploying its most advanced weapons. It didn't matter. Humanity adapted too quickly. Every engagement made them stronger, every battle taught them something new. Imperial commanders, trained for traditional warfare, couldn't keep up. The Empire had grown complacent, ruling through fear, believing its size alone was enough to maintain control. It had never prepared for an enemy that refused to be intimidated. Then came the moment that changed everything. A human fleet, smaller than anything the Empire had ever considered a real threat, launched a coordinated assault on an Imperial stronghold. It should have been impossible. The defenses were too strong, the location too secure. But the attack wasn't about brute force. It was about precision. Human forces slipped past outer defenses, disrupted energy grids, sabotaged key systems. By the time the Empire realized what was happening, it was too late. The stronghold didn't fall in a grand battle. It simply stopped functioning. The captured prisoners, those who had been held in secret, were freed. The stories they told spread faster than the war itself. Stories of torture, of experiments, of executions far beyond what the Empire had shown publicly. The massacre that had started the war had been a message. Now, humanity had one of its own. There would be no forgiveness. Other species, long silent under imperial rule, began to take notice. Some saw an opportunity. Some saw hope. And some, for the first time in generations, saw a real chance at rebellion. The war was no longer just between humanity and the Empire. The galaxy itself was beginning to shift. The Empire, once untouchable, had made a mistake. It had treated humanity like every other species before it. It had expected surrender, expected fear. What it had created instead was something far worse. It had created an enemy that would never stop. The war had transformed. What began as an act of vengeance had evolved into something far greater. Humanity was no longer just retaliating, it was dismantling an empire. The Empire responded with overwhelming force, deploying entire fleets to crush human resistance. Its war machine, built over centuries, moved with brutal efficiency. Planets suspected of harboring human sympathizers were bombed into submission. Imperial intelligence sought to infiltrate human command, to sow discord and misinformation. The galaxy had seen this before. This was how the Empire won. But humanity refused to play by the rules. Every attack, every strike, every victory had been calculated. The Empire's forces were massive but slow. It relied on control, on fear, on subjugation. Humanity relied on none of those things. Its fleets moved unpredictably, striking supply chains instead of fortresses, crippling infrastructure instead of fighting wars of attrition. The Empire, for all its power, was starting to bleed. Then came the breaking point. A decisive battle on the edge of Imperial space. A trap set by the Empire, a fleet positioned to finally crush the rebellion. The numbers were overwhelming, the firepower insurmountable. Victory was assured. Until it wasn't. Humanity did not engage in a direct confrontation. It had no interest in matching the Empire's strength. Instead, it turned the battlefield itself into a weapon. The Empire's ships, massive and heavily armored, found themselves unable to maneuver in the debris field humanity had chosen as the battleground. Then the attacks began, small, fast-moving human vessels striking from impossible angles, targeting engines, weapon systems, weak points. Not fighting to destroy, but to disable, to cripple. It was not a battle. It was dissection. When the dust settled, the Empire's forces were shattered. Hundreds of its ships were left drifting, unable to retreat, unable to fight. The few that survived fled in disarray. For the first time in history, an Imperial fleet had been not just defeated, but humiliated. And the galaxy was watching. Rebellions ignited across Imperial space. Planets that had suffered under its rule now saw an opportunity. They had never dared to resist before, believing the Empire invincible. But humanity had proven otherwise. Suddenly, entire systems were rising up, refusing to obey, refusing to submit. The war was no longer just humanity's war. It had become a galactic revolution. The Empire's response was brutal. Entire populations were erased as warnings. Any species suspected of aiding humanity was marked for extermination. The Emperor himself issued an ultimatum: surrender or face annihilation. Humanity's response was just as clear. There would be no surrender. The diplomat who had once fought for peace now stood as the voice of the war. He had seen what the Empire had done, what it continued to do. He had long believed that war was failure. Now he understood, some failures could not be undone. Some wars had to be won. The final stage of the war began. Humanity had no interest in peace talks, no interest in negotiations. It had one goal: the complete destruction of the Empire's ability to rule. Strikes became more frequent, more precise. Key supply centers were wiped out. The Empire's greatest shipyards, the backbone of its fleet production, were infiltrated and sabotaged, leaving the Empire unable to replace its losses. The war was no longer about survival. It was about victory. The Empire's control began to fracture. Generals who had once sworn unwavering loyalty now saw the truth: humanity was not a temporary problem. It was an existential threat. Some tried to negotiate, to seek a truce. They were ignored. There was no truce. Then came the first true collapse. A high-ranking Imperial admiral, seeing the writing on the wall, defected. He didn't just bring ships, he brought intelligence. Codes, fleet movements, defense plans. Everything the Empire had kept hidden. Everything humanity needed. Armed with this knowledge, humanity launched its final offensive. The heart of the Empire, once untouchable, was now vulnerable. The walls that had protected it for centuries were cracking. The war was no longer in the outer territories. It was at the Empire's doorstep. The Emperor, once confident, once untouchable, now faced the reality he had created. The enemy he had dismissed, the species he had considered weak, had done the impossible. And now, it was coming for him. The war was ending. Not in negotiations, not in treaties, but in fire. The Empire, once the undisputed ruler of the galaxy, was crumbling. Its fleets were scattered, its leaders divided, its citizens no longer afraid. Humanity had not just won battles, it had broken the illusion of imperial invincibility. The final assault was inevitable. The imperial core worlds, once thought untouchable, were now within striking distance. Panic spread among the ruling elite. Governors fled, admirals turned deserter, entire sectors declared independence. The Emperor, once a figure of absolute power, found himself isolated, abandoned by those who had sworn loyalty to him. But the Empire did not surrender. Even in its death throes, it fought with desperation. What remained of its once mighty fleet was recalled, forming a last defensive line around the capital world. It was a force built not to win, but to make humanity pay for every inch of ground it took. Humanity did not hesitate. The assault began, not as a reckless charge, but as a calculated dismantling of the Empire's last stronghold. Coordinated strikes shattered planetary defenses, orbital stations were destroyed with surgical precision, and elite Imperial forces found themselves overwhelmed by an enemy that had spent the war adapting, evolving, perfecting its methods. The final battle was not a grand, glorious last stand. It was systematic destruction. The Empire, for all its history, all its might, had built its rule on the belief that no enemy could ever reach its heart. It had never planned for this moment. Resistance collapsed within hours. What remained of the Imperial fleet was either destroyed or captured. The palace, once the seat of galactic power, stood surrounded. The Emperor, who had once broadcast messages of strength, now sat in silence, watching as everything he had built was torn apart. The diplomat, the man who had once tried to prevent this war, was among the first to step onto Imperial soil. He did not come to negotiate. There was nothing left to discuss. The war had begun with a message, the execution of helpless prisoners. It ended with another. The Emperor was taken, not as a ruler, but as a prisoner of war. There was no trial, no speech, no grand display of vengeance. There was only a single broadcast, sent across the entire galaxy: humanity had won. The Empire was finished. In the days that followed, the remnants of imperial rule were dismantled. Worlds that had suffered under its control now chose their own paths. Some formed alliances with humanity, others reclaimed their independence. But one thing was clear: the age of the Empire was over. Humanity did not claim the throne. It had no interest in ruling over those it had freed. The war had never been about conquest. It had been about justice. And justice had been delivered. The diplomat, once a man of peace, looked upon the world that had once seemed untouchable. He had spent his life believing war was a failure. But some failures, he now understood, could not be avoided. As humanity's fleets departed, leaving behind the ruins of an empire that had once seemed eternal, the message was clear. Never again.